Hi, this is Maggie Byrns, and this is my summary on what we did this semester in Psychological Foundations for Education. I thought I'd start talking about a few important definitions that we began the course with. The first was the difference between a philosophy and a theory. So philosophy is a more general term for the study of reality, causes, the principles of existence, and thought. This is what has been used in the past to guide research and set parameters for future research. A theory is a little bit more concrete. It gives an explanation of how certain facts fit together. It determines which facts are the most important and what those relationships are between those facts. And it kind of helps researchers make sense of facts and puts them together in a way that's meaningful so they can be used to explain and predict development and behavior. We also talked about the difference between a concept and a construct. So a concept is more of a general cognitive perception. It's usually established from experiences and research. It's generalizable and accepted by a majority of people. Construct, on the other hand, is more something that you want to look at. It may be created based on a theory. It's not always the easiest thing to identify, but it's something in research that you're interested in studying specifically. Sometimes it is measurable, and it might be something like demographic data, age, height, hair color, things like that. But sometimes it's something that's more abstract. It might be that you're interested in researching self-esteem of students, political leanings of a group of people, things like that. One thing I have learned in this course is that it really is very important to establish what your constructs are in research. So the first major branch of theories that we got into was psychoanalysis. Sigmund Freud is probably the earliest psychoanalyst. And Erik Erikson was the one who came up with the psychosocial theory of personality development. This was based on the epigenetic principle, which basically said that your genes at birth sort of establish a blueprint or construction plan for the schedule of development throughout your entire life. He came up with 8 stages of development. So the first 5 are related to childhood. Trust versus mistrust is from birth to about 1 year, and this is when infants really learn whether they're going to be trustful of humans or mistrust humans based on the level of care that they've received. The second stage is the autonomy versus shame or doubt stage from about 2 to 3 years old. This is when toddlers really first strive to try and gain independence. Overly strict adults can sometimes cause the toddler to feel shame and doubt. So guidance by adults is really important in this stage. Initiative versus guilt is from about 3 to 6 years old, and this is when preschoolers really begin to act more independently. Language development really plays a role in helping expand their imagination and their initiative. The industry versus inferiority stage is from about 7 to 12 years old, and this is when the child really begins to want to do worthwhile activities. He wants to gain recognition for his work, and this is a time when it's important for adults to really give students guided tasks to help them develop their sense of industry. During the adolescent stage, that would be the identity versus identity diffusion, and this is when the child really becomes an adolescent and starts to develop their sense of self. Childhood doesn't really fit that view anymore, and so this is when they're starting to really branch out and be a little bit more independent and start to think about who they want to be as an adult. Erikson also identified 3 stages of adult development, which is a little bit unusual for his time. But the intimacy, solidarity versus isolation stage usually takes place in the 20s, and that's usually when people start to get serious about who they're dating, start thinking about who they want to marry and spend their life with. The generativity versus stagnation stage can happen anytime from your 20s to about your 50s, and this is when people really start to settle down. They really spend their life they want to spend their life maybe with one person, and this may be the time people start thinking about children. And then the last stage is the integrity versus despair, disgust stage. And this is later in life, 50s to 60s, when you really start to accept your lifestyle and you strive to continue to grow as a responsible adult. We did watch this clip, which I'd recommend watching if you have time, and this was the video from Pixar that uses Pixar movies to demonstrate these stages of life. I thought this was a really good explanation of the different stages. And then if you're interested in further reading, I did find his book, The Identity, Youth, and Crisis, a really good resource when we were studying Erikson's stages. Next came the theories of behaviorism. And so behaviorism in general is just based on observations of the subject's response to different stimuli. This was earlier when we first kind of started talking about behaviorism. People would call this the SR, the stimulus response relationship. You might think back to Pavlov's dogs. He was one of the earliest behaviorists, and he was the one who trained the dogs rather to salivate when they heard a bell, and that was called classical conditioning. Thorndike and Watson were some very prominent behaviorists. B.F. Skinner is probably the most famous, known for his operant conditioning. And the idea with operant conditioning is that all human behavior is in response to some type of stimuli. Now, it may not be an external stimuli like the bell with Pavlov's dogs, but it might be a stimuli that's happening in your brain that you don't even realize is happening. But the idea is that everyone's behavior is based on some sort of response to something happening in their mind. He proposed that behavior could be shaped and modified through operant conditioning. And so he was the first to really talk about positive or negative reinforcements or positive or negative punishments. I think the best use for this in today's education world is anytime you have to teach students factual information. We say, like in math especially, we talk about drilling and killing things like multiplication facts and things like that. This is a really good application of when behaviorism can be used. And really anytime you want to shape a child's behavior in one way or another, this is what conditioning is good for. The next theory we got into was social cognition theory, and that's based on the idea of contextualism, which suggests that human development changes occur primarily due to the relationship with the subject's environment. Albert Bandura was a very, very huge proponent of social cognition theory. He was one of the first to say that environment plays a really big role in development that had been previously thought by behaviorists. He suggested rather that children are not necessarily looking to fill a need or be rewarded for something as behaviorism had previously suggested. Instead, children are more likely to learn by modeling and imitating what they see in the world around them. Children may observe others, either other children, older children, or adults, and sometimes they may even store experiences that they can use for future learning, even though that behavior is not necessarily exhibited at the time when the learning might have occurred. And he called that incidental learning. He was famous mostly for the Bobo doll experiments, and the Bobo doll experiments were essentially when groups of children were asked to watch videos of adults kicking and punching a Bobo doll, and he basically concluded that children were more likely to be aggressive with the doll later on their own if they had watched the video of adults. There's a very good video here on YouTube on the Bobo doll experiments if you're interested. And I'd also recommend this journal article on self-efficacy that Bandura wrote in 1977. It was actually very interesting also. So the next major branch of psychology that we talked about was cognitive development. And Jean Piaget is probably one of the most famous cognitive development psychologists. And he was interested in researching how children develop knowledge as they grow. So the question he asked was a little different. It was, how does knowledge develop in humans? So he was known for developing new clinical methods for research. So his research methods were a little bit different than those of his predecessors. He would first observe children's reactions to given problems, then compose hypotheses based on his observations. Then he'd go back and test those hypotheses by, again, asking questions to the children and posing new problems and observing what they did to try to figure out their thought processes in solving those problems. He coined the term schemes, which were essentially mental concepts of ideas that were formed through experiences and events. We'd often call this just prior knowledge. And this prior knowledge gave children a way to facilitate their learning. There were really two ways that this occurred. One was through assimilation. So first, what children would try to do is understand new things in terms of schemes that they already know. And then if they couldn't make new information work with existing schemes, then they would do what's called adaptation, or they would adjust their older existing schemes to fit with new information. Schemes could be acquired through hereditary factors, physical experiences and everyday experiences children have, social transmission either through formal education or through just interactions with other people as they go through their lives, or a combination and balance of all three of these. So Piaget came up with 4 stages of development. The first was the sensory motor period, which is from birth to about 2 years. And this is when infants are basically developing their reflexes, adaptive reactions, object relations, object permanence, and the very beginning of intelligence is forming. Then pre-operational thought period is from about 2 to 7 years old. And this is known for when egocentric speech starts, and that's where you might see young children talking to themselves, and that's a way for them to learn and process information. They may start having some intuitive thought at this age. And then the next stage is the concrete operations period from 7 to 11 years, and this is when children are very good at problem solving when they can work with concrete identifiable objects. And then the last stage of development is the formal operations period from 11 to 15 years. And so logical thinking skills are developing. Children are able to have more abstract thought and maybe solve problems that they not necessarily see right in front of them. I kind of equate this to when children can think abstractly, and this is the best time maybe to talk about teaching them algebra because they can start thinking about those abstract concepts. So another well-known cognitivist was Lev Vygotsky. And he believed that conceptual thought was strongly influenced by education and culture. In other words, it was not just that children achieved higher level thinking and conceptual thought due to maturation, but he felt that this was primarily influenced by education and culture. He developed several educational practices that are still in use today: scaffolding, cooperative learning, reciprocal teaching, and zone of proximal development. So the next major branch of theories that we discussed were information processing theories. And these theories are there to seek to explain how information is processed inside the brain. They focus on memory storage, memory retrieval, and attention, and how all of those things work together. With previous theories, input stimuli and output behavior could be observed, but that didn't explain what was happening inside the brain and how the brain was processing and storing information, and that's kind of how this branch of theories developed. Several classical kind of components in all information processing theories. You've got your sensory organs, your eyes, your ears, your sense of touch, those things to receive information through external stimuli. Your short-term memory is where information is initially coded and processed. And then from there, your brain decides what's it going to do with it. It's going to keep the information, and if it does, it puts it in your long-term memory, where it's stored indefinitely. And then usually muscle systems are included as some part of the component system for an information processing theory to perform motor acts as needed for reaction to information. There is some debate about when memories are first stored and retrieved in terms of age. Some preschoolers have memories of familiar events. Processing ability definitely strengthens considerably during adolescence. It improves greatly as you get older, but during the adolescence time period, that's when children are better at processing information, their speed of processing, and their attention all seem to get stronger and better focused. This reading, if you're interested, is some work on cognitive load theory, which specifically speaks to limits on working memory. The next branch of major theories we talked about were humanistic theories. And you can kind of think of this as how one defines themselves, how one views themselves. Humanistic psychologists tend to believe that a person's self-image and motivation are all driven from within, more so than by external environmental factors. Humanists analyze introspectively through thoughts and feelings. They reject behaviorism and psychoanalysis, and they believe that human motivation, like I said, is really driven by those internal emotions. They believe very strongly that everyone has a natural biological desire to reach self-actualization. Maslow is probably the most famous humanistic psychologist, and he was probably most known for his hierarchy of needs. So his hierarchy of needs suggested that human motivation is driven by these needs that are in an inherent order. So the base of the hierarchy are physical needs: food, water, shelter, clothing, things like that. If those things are not met, nothing else matters. Those things have to be taken care of first. Once those are taken care of, safety needs have to be addressed. So everyone's got to have a sense of safety from harm, a sense of stability in their life. Then the next level of needs that has to be addressed are belongingness. So the need to have love and intimacy with other people in your life. The next level are esteem needs, so that includes self-esteem and esteem for others. And then the final peak of the hierarchy are self-actualization needs. In other words, feeling like you fulfilled your own destiny. And basically Maslow was a very strong believer, unless those bottom level needs are taken care of, the ones at the top can never be accomplished. A couple further readings here on Maslow that I found very useful when I was doing my research. And then the last branch of theories that we discussed were ecological theories. And ecological theorists tend to believe that environmental influences play a very, very large role in development. Human behavior can be affected greatly by things happening all around us. Urban crowding, for example, if you're in a big urban area, rural development, lack of resources, things like that. Yuri Bronfenbrenner, I think I'm saying that right, was probably the most famous psychologist in this branch of theory. He believed that child's behavior was strongly influenced by his or her perceptions of what was called behavior settings. So behavior settings were essentially the way that people typically act in a given setting. And so his ecological theory was used to explain this. And so his theory basically says that child development is impacted by these different interacting systems. And so the child would be at the center of the theory, and then, or the center of the system rather. And then the first thing that would have influence on the child would be the child's microsystem. So those are the immediate things that the child may see day to day. Family members, school, teachers at school, children at school, church, if they go to church regularly. Then they were affected by the mesosystem, which is essentially the interactions of all of their microsystems. Then the next thing to affect them would be their exosystem, which is extended family members, maybe neighbors, things that they might have contact with, but not as often as they would for parts of their microsystem. Then they had their macrosystem, was essentially the overarching systems of their culture, attitudes, beliefs, maybe political opinions, things happening at government level that might play a role in what's happening in the child's home life. Later, chronosystem was added to this, and that essentially accounted for changes over the lifespan, major life events that would play a role in these different systems.